Colleagues, welcome again. This is the second in a four-part series on talking about different options and terms and conditions of a peer-to-peer sale. As we've mentioned many times before, in today's optometric world, so much of what is written and talked about is the impact of private equity. But we still are seeing there's no question that the preponderance of transactions in the market are really still peer-to-peer, meaning one optometrist selling their practice to another. And so we thought it would be very helpful to also be able to discuss some of those ideas today and give you some thoughts on what's happening in our marketplace as it relates to one optometrist selling their practice to another. I'd like to again introduce my good friend, Dr. Sandy Carman. Sandy's our Vice President in the Practice Transition Division. Sandy had a very successful large private practice in the Atlanta metropolitan area. And Sandy also has, Dr. Carman also has an MBA, so he's well versed on the business side of things. Dr. Carman, welcome.
Thank you very much.
I trust things are well in Atlanta.
Yep, things are going great.
Good.
You know, we talked last time about the different options that a doctor would have in selling their practice or merging their practice with another doctor. When I sold mine, one of the very first things that was kind of like a mystery is how should I try to appraise the value of the practice? What was my practice worth, and what should I consider asking for the practice? So, you know, let's cover what you would consider a fair value of a practice would be and how you would come up with that.
Very good. Yes, thanks, doctor. You know, there's no question. Price may not be, it certainly is not the only thing, and it may not even in some ways be the most important thing, but it is certainly an issue that has to be covered fairly early on. You know, you can have a buyer and seller in a transaction, and I've been involved in several of these, where the buyer and seller are very compatible on a lot of issues. They have a similar philosophy in terms of patient care. They are fairly reasonable people. They kind of keep their eye focused on the end game, which is the transaction and the sale of the practice. But they may have a very different opinion on what the intrinsic value of the business that is for sale, what that value is. And if I think my practice is worth $600,000 and you think it's worth only $300,000, no matter how compatible we are, if we have a difference of that wide a range of difference in the sense of the value of the practice or the business, the likelihood of us getting that transaction put together is not very good. And so price is again, it may not be the most important thing. It certainly is not the only thing, but we probably, in most cases, I think we try to start there to ascertain before we even perhaps maybe appraise the practice. Are both of the parties involved in the transaction close on the same page of what they understand value? One other thing I think, Dr. Carman, and you probably can attest to this as well, when I gave a talk not long ago at one of the state associations, and a doctor said, I assume price is the biggest stumbling block, correct? And I said, no, actually it is not. And I said, and one of the reasons that over the last, say, 7 to 10 years, price has not really been the biggest stumbling block in most transactions is because the value of an optometric practice has been widely reported on. All of your major banks that finance practices, obviously Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Wintrust in Chicago, Zion Bank out of Boston, Vision One out of California. They've all had people who have written articles. They've gone to many of the optometry schools and lectured. I've published several articles. And so most people have a pretty good intrinsic sense of the value of a practice. Many doctors, because they don't really know what the value of their business is, they want it appraised, and it's a very good place to start. As you know, we have a program for that. We probably do more appraisals on practices than anybody in the country. But just to give our listeners today some idea, generally, if a practice is in excess of $500,000 of collected revenue per year or more, so you're doing roughly $10,000 a week in revenue, and that's collected revenue. That would be line 1 of your tax return. A practice generally will appraise for somewhere between 60 to 65% of that number. So if you took a practice and averaged its last 3 years revenue, and let's just say that practice averaged $800,000 over the last 3 years, you would expect that that practice should appraise somewhere for $475,000 on the low end to maybe 500, 525 on the high end. That gives you a pretty good place to understand the value. The reason that I mentioned 500,000 or more, generally, if a practice is doing revenue less than $500,000, 300, 320, they generally appraise for 40 to 50% of their revenue. And there's a lot of reasons for that. That certainly doesn't mean it's not a good practice. It would not be a good practice to look at buying. It's just when you look at the methodology that is commonly used to appraise practices, a smaller practice doesn't have enough free cash flow that would drive the multiple above 45 or 50%. But a good easy way, if you have we'll use base 100. If you've got $1 million practice, 60% obviously is 600,000 and 65% is 650,000. So that should be kind of your range of value. And of course, we talked in our other video series on private equity, that private equity, the value in private equity is quite different. It generally is 90 to 100% to sometimes 120 or 30% of revenue. So maybe a way to think about if you're selling your practice to a peer, you probably will receive 30 to 40% less than if you were selling it to private equity. But that's the reality of a peer-to-peer sale. And there's obviously nothing wrong with that. That 60 to 65% valuation multiple, and it will line up nicely with the way banks, with all your big banks that I just mentioned, with the way they appraise or do their cash flow analysis on the value. And it's important because it's very hard to move to all the other terms and conditions of a transaction and sale if the two parties just, again, are not seeing eye to eye, pardon the reference, if they're not seeing eye to eye on the value of an optometric practice. Now, do some practices sell for much more than 65%? Yes, sometimes they do. And sometimes they appraise for way more than that. Just because they happen to be very well run and they spend an awful lot of free cash flow. Do some practices sell, even large practices appraise for 50% multiple? Absolutely, because again, they may have very high cost structures that do not enable the practice to generate sufficient cash flows that would make the practice appraise for those normal multiples. So practices today are still, and they generally, I think another interesting thing that's important is a practice generally, if it's appraised correctly, generally will sell for within 5% of its appraised value. There are some exceptions, obviously, to that rule, but as a good rule of thumb, so for our listeners today, if you were trying to do some financial planning for yourself and say, well, what part of my, say, retirement portfolio will my practice be? What amount of money will it provide to my retirement? If that 65% multiple is a good place to start, and you probably should sell within plus or minus 5% of that number. A good rule of thumb is a practice generally sells for around 62.5% of its revenue. So that'll give our listeners today a real good idea, I think, of what the value of a practice.
Good.
Any other
Very
thoughts?
good information.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think it's helpful because again, not to overstate it or beat it to death, but there's a lot of terms and conditions. There's a lot of I's to dot and T's to cross when you sell a business, and they're fairly time consuming. They're not difficult. They're not as difficult as what all of you doctors do in the exam room every day. That's difficult. These are not overly difficult issues, but there's no sense of spending a lot of time with your attorney and money with your accountants if we can't have a meeting of the minds on the value of the practice. But the good news, I feel, not very often anymore, very rarely do I have a real huge difference in a transaction where the buyer or seller has just a complete unreasonable position on value. So that's 60 to 65% is a good multiple if your practice is less than 500,000. 40 to 50% is a good idea of what it will value out at.
Well, and I think that's a good point. I think every doctor should really consider getting an appraisal first to make sure that everybody's on the same page, and understand the appraisal is just the numbers. There's really no making it go one way or the other. It is what it is. The
Yes.
numbers will speak. A lot of times doctors will say, well, what about this or that? It's totally based on the numbers of the practice. So it's a
Yeah.
very good reading that both parties can say this is a neutral, unbiased opinion of the practice.
That's a very good point. It's objective, it's arm's length. It doesn't tend to side one way or the other for the buyer or toward the seller. It's just a third party, arm's length, objective look at what the intrinsic value of the practice is. And it's helpful, especially if a one party is just not very knowledgeable about that. It gives them a very good idea. And one other thing, Dr. Carmen, just in a final thought, one other thing that I'd like to caution all of our listeners today, one thing, make sure that you never do. I have been involved in some transactions where this was unbeknown to me. The potential buyer and seller agreed before they engaged us for the appraisal that whatever the practice appraised for, that's what they would sell it for. An appraisal is simply a starting place. Once you have that number, say $500,000, there could be a lot of reasons why that number could be adjusted upward, or in many cases, that number could be adjusted downward. Over the last several years, for example, one of the big adjustments that many buyers wrongfully did when making an offer on a practice was trying to understand what the state of the EHR system was in the practice they were buying. If a doctor had decided not to upgrade their EHR, or they weren't really even using a EHR, certainly not a very robust EHR, and obviously for a young doctor going forward trying to practice a lot of medical optometry, that was crucial. If I have not updated or had not updated my servers to Windows 10, and that was something that was going to fall to the buyer rightfully was going to adjust that cost out of the value of the practice. And so one thing that can be very difficult is to agree ahead of time that whatever it appraises for, that will be the final purchase price. Because once you have that appraised value, then both the buyer and the seller, may have to make some tweaks to it, to arrive at a fair and reasonable final selling price. So I hope that was helpful today for our listeners.
Very good.